Good afternoon, guys. Hope you guys are having a wonderful afternoon. I've had this on my mind pretty much since UFC 328, and I couldn't help but think about the really insane impact that a loss has on a seemingly unbeatable fighter, right? And obviously, we saw this with Hamzat Chimaev, but we've seen this before. You know, we saw it with Anderson Silva against Chris Weidman. That was really one of the most shocking ones in UFC history. We've seen it with Alex Pereira and his second fight against Israel Adesanya. And in this example, we're going to be talking about Marab and Petr Yan in their second fight. And obviously, we've seen it with Hamzat Chimaev and Sean Strickland. But to begin, using Marab as an example, Marab seemed to be the only one who had an answer for the entire bantamweight division. He had already beaten Petr Yan before. He had even beaten Umar Nurmagomedov, who a lot of people were stating that would be the answer to Marab's insane chain wrestling and infinite cardio. So he's the machine, greatest bantamweight of all time. And he was on a 14 fight win streak. And then he has his first loss in over 7 years. First loss in over 7 years to Russia's very own Petr Yan. Right? And then a few things start to happen after this. A few things start to happen after this. The first thing that happens is the aura loss, right? Fans no longer immediately take Marab's side when they see a new fight announced, right? Because previously what would happen is we would see a fight announcement between Marab and someone, or Hamzat and someone, or Kamaru Usman and someone, and automatically during the peak of their careers, during the peak of their win streaks, everyone would automatically say, "Oh, Marab by however he wants, Hamzat by however he wants, Usman by however he wants." But what we've noticed is that when these seemingly unbeatable fighters lose for the first time, the fans no longer immediately take their side, as opposed to previously where they would automatically say, yeah, this fighter's going to win 1,000,000% of the time. And then the betting odds shift, and they never quite return to that golden aura of invincibility, and their spiritual pressure is now less potent, right? We heard Dustin Poirier discuss this when he was talking about Conor McGregor in an interview that he had. And that fear factor was just no longer there. That aura of invincibility was just gone. And then what happens is your opponents begin to study film. They start to copy the blueprint. They start to look at the solution to that equation, right? They start to assess, okay, why did so-and-so have success? Why did Sean Strickland see success against Hamzat Chimaev? Why did Petr Yan in their second outing see success against Merab Dvalishvili? And then the market adapts. The division adapts. So what happens now is that in addition to the aura loss and the blueprint now being displayed for the whole world to see, the media starts to shift. They start to say, oh, Merab was never that good. Hamzat was never that good. Usman was never that good. We start to see a lot of these new claims come out, right? And then people start reevaluating the legacies of these fighters. Now, a lot of this is, casual fans, people who are new to MMA, making these claims largely for rage bait purposes, but it still happens regardless, even as ridiculous as it may sound. I mean, even if we look at someone like Hamzat Chimaev recently where he lost, Hamzat is still arguably the most dangerous fighter at the 185 division, you know? But we're seeing claims that he was never that good, this, that, and the other, right? And then what happens after that? Two potential outcomes. The division adapts, and in response to the division adapting, the dethroned champ either evolves in some way or remains largely unchanged. And this is really where it gets pivotal, and the development or lack thereof really becomes evident in their later bouts. Because when the division adapts, this means that the division's difficulty is increasing, the fighters are getting smarter, and more people now have confidence that they can now defeat you as a champion. And if we move on, what we see is that their legacy shifts depending on the actions that they take thereafter. If they evolve and they fix their weaknesses, or if they just get so much better at what they already do to where whatever adaptation the division made doesn't actually make a difference, what we'll see is that this fighter continues to ascend. They continue to ascend. And we actually saw this with Sean Strickland. He had lost his belt against DDP, arguably, very, very arguably. Even Dana White said that Sean had won that fight, but that's neither here nor there, right? And he ascended again because, as we can see right now, Sean Strickland is the current middleweight champion of the world, right? Or what happens is they begin to see decline. And decline is unfortunately where we've seen a lot of some of my favorite champions go, such as Israel Adesanya and Anderson Silva. Primarily Anderson Silva, because we saw this happen with him. He never really evolved with the times. The competition, like I said before, adapted. It evolved, it got better. Fighters naturally over time get better the more data they have access to, the more information that they're able to digest, and the more data that they collect. Because that's ultimately what good coaching is: studying film, making data backed suggestions for your fighter to combat whatever difficulty that they inevitably will face in the ring, right? So we never actually saw that development from Anderson. We never actually saw that development from Izzy. And unfortunately, we saw them go into the decline area instead of the ascension area. And it's very difficult to get to that ascension because naturally, upward and downward spirals are equally powerful, right? You lose, and then depending on how that impacts your emotions, your mentality, the odds of you losing again do go up. It's for the same reason why, when a fighter becomes a champion, it's said that they get 15 to 20% better. And we saw this with Joshua Van in his recent bout against Tatsuro Taira, right? So depending on which end of the spiral they end up in, they will either end up in the ascension category or the decline category. And this is largely what happens when a seemingly unbeatable fighter ends up taking that first loss in a long time or their first loss ever. And that's really one of the large patterns that I've noticed in watching MMA. And that became very clear to me after watching UFC 328. And I just had to sift through my mind and find the examples. And there's so many of them that we can observe where a fighter was at the top of his game. And then when they didn't adjust, they ended up either falling into this decline state or they do adjust and they end up being champ again. Those are my thoughts. Thank you for watching.